Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And today on the show, I welcome my good friend Simon Geale. Simon is the Executive Vice President at Proxima. And this is one of my favourite conversations that I've had on the podcast. We started with the intention of focusing on the art of storytelling, and we do talk a lot about that, as Simon shares his structure for creating and telling stories that influence executives. Simon's definitely been putting that into practice over the past couple of years, with appearances across media outlets like the BBC, CNBC, and the Wall Street Journal, and many more. But our conversation went a lot deeper than that. We recorded it face-to-face on my recent trip to the UK, and we discussed the health of the procurement profession, some of our frustrations, and some of the things in procurement that we're excited about. And as I mentioned, we talked about storytelling, but we also get into our own vulnerabilities. We're both introverts, and we talk about speaking publicly and some of the ways that we both try and overcome those fears. Simon asks me a number of questions on my approaches to growing Art of Procurement, and it's also the first time that the Gruffalo has made an appearance in an Art of Procurement podcast. I'm sure my kids would be happy to hear that. I'm publishing the whole hour of the conversation. I hope that you find it as interesting as I did sat across the table from Simon. So I start in familiar territory by asking Simon if he found procurement or if procurement found him.
I've heard you ask that question to a number of people, and I've often asked myself, which one is it? And I don't really know. So I'm going to tell you the story, and then perhaps you can tell me.
Yeah.
So I was at university. I finished university. I did a degree in business and French, although I wasn't particularly academic. I think I enjoyed myself through that 4-year period. And at the end of it, it all became real, and I couldn't get a job. I was trying really hard. I was applying for all sorts of things, and I couldn't get a job. And it was back in the days when the job ads used to appear in a newspaper, in a physical newspaper, if you can believe that. And on a Wednesday, the Daily Telegraph, which is my dad's reader choice, don't judge me for that, that would come in, and I saw this little ad in the bottom corner, and it said a master's in procurement. And I thought, well, I'm applying for everything, so I'll apply for that. And I ended up going to this interview for this master's in procurement, and it turns out it was in the south of France, in Bordeaux. And I thought to myself, well, I fancy a piece of this. So I didn't really know what procurement was. I didn't really know what it entailed, but I went down to the south of France. I had an amazing year. I really enjoyed it. And then I sort of fell into a job with Philips Electronics in the Netherlands, within their global IT procurement team. And so when you ask me the question, did I find it or did it find me? I think I found a job ad.
I think it found you, by the sounds of it.
Yeah, I definitely found my mojo in that period in Holland. That was where it suddenly clicked with me. Hey, hang on, this could be quite fun.
Do you remember what it was about it that made you think that?
I do. And it was partly, in those days, I think it was partly a connection to the product or the mission of the company. Yeah. That was really important to me. That was something I struggled with when I moved into consulting, actually. But it was this sort of feeling of, I think, camaraderie and teamwork. That was really important to me as well. But at the time, we were doing this thing called BEST. And I can't remember what BEST stood for. Clearly, it was an acronym. I can't remember. But it was all about taking procurement from where it was, which was quite sort of, conventional, and deploying all of these new strategies and tactics like, 20 years ago, we're talking now, supplier management and development plans and upskilling people. And I guess I felt like I was going through a change process, and I got to do all these cool things, like I set up an SRM program. I was the first person to do that in indirect procurement, which was really, really exciting. So I think it was a variety.
In those, when I think back 20 plus years ago, Philips was one of my biggest suppliers.
Yeah.
I was in the automotive business. So you were trying to find the gains that I was taking away from you as a buyer in automotive lighting at the time.
Probably. And when I joined the company, I remember I was in Philips Netherlands headquarters in Eindhoven. And even even the lids on the toilet seats had the Philips logo on them. You know, everything was made by Philips. In the old days, you could walk into a supermarket and pay for your shopping with your employee number. It was such a sort of cultural phenomenon, but also so clearly out of date and in need of transformation. And I think I've really felt a part of that change, and that was really exciting.
Now, today you work for Proxima. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, for those who haven't heard about Proxima or what Proxima do, who are you?
Well, given that I'm partly in charge of marketing, the thought that there's people listening who don't know who Proxima is, I'm gonna let that one slide.
Maybe the listeners who are out there in northern Alaska or something like that.
Okay, now that seems reasonable. So we're a procurement consulting firm. I guess until recently we're relatively small, around 300 people. But what's interesting about us is that we work with some of the world's largest companies. So generally quite large and complex companies, or businesses that want to become large and complex companies. And the tagline that we use is that we deliver purposeful and profitable change. And so essentially, if you really break down what that means, it means we help people to spend their money wisely and spend it well. Now, me personally in Proxima, I've been there 12 years, so I've done a few things. I've enjoyed the variety, I've enjoyed the successes and the failures. That's why I'm still there. But my job today is to really present Proxima into the outside world. So it's to keep a pulse on the challenges that are being faced by business, think about how procurement can solve them, and then get Proxima sort of into that space talking about those things.
Mm-hmm. And so your role today, you said you've been there for 12 years, and I know we talked a lot about, actually before we recorded, some of the things that kind of make up your role today, but what does, and I asked this for context, as we go into the conversation, what does a day look like for you? What are the things that you're spending most of your time at Proxima doing?
Yeah, okay, so, part of my role, so my role title is actually CPO, but it's a bit of a CPO with a twist. Because as you can imagine, for 300 people, we don't personally buy that many things, but my job essentially is to understand what's happening in procurement. So as part of that, I sort of have market and analyst relations. So I talk to lots of people to find out what's happening. I also do work in the media, so trying to promote the profession and our business into the media. I run our marketing team. I say I run our marketing team, more like they run me. So all of our thinking, thought leadership, and how we present the company. And I'm also responsible for developing and thinking about what products and services we might do next.
Yeah.
I think the critical thing is that I don't get involved in selling or delivering, because I've done that in the past, and both of which have proved to be a disaster.
You're staying well clear of that then?
Yeah, I mean, you got to know your boundaries, haven't you? It's taken me 12 years, but maybe I'm just beginning to learn what I'm good at. But I think the most important thing, I went to Procurement Leaders the other week in London, and I was speaking to a CPO afterwards, and I said, "What did you think?" He said, "One of my teams said something really interesting." I said, "What was that?" He said, they came out, and I said, "What did you think of the presentations?" And he said, "Well, they're all very technically good, but we didn't get to know the people. We didn't get to know who they are and what makes them tick." And so I promised that from now on, I'll always do that. So the most interesting thing about me is I'm in my mid-40s. I started my career late. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I probably still don't know what I want to do next. I'm quite annoying to work with. I'm married. I've got 2 young kids, so I don't have any hobbies anymore, other than sort of being a horse and a taxi driver.
And football.
I love football.
We're talking off mic about that as well. Ironically, we're actually recording here from Peterborough United Football Club, which is quite surreal for me to be mixing my procurement and my football worlds. But I think we spent more time talking about football than we did procurement, so we're getting ready.
Yeah, maybe that's an illustration of where our real passions lie. Momentous for me to be here, because Peterborough United have I've crossed paths with them before, sort of a couple of decades ago, so a bit surreal for me too.
You said that you're annoying to work with. Why is that?
I think I'm annoying for many reasons. Partly because I struggle to concentrate on anything for any sort of period of time. I'm always questioning people on can you do things differently? What are you going to do differently? What's going to be better? I have a really short attention span. I think think I'm just really annoying generally. But hopefully there's some charm in there somewhere.
We'll draw that out hopefully today. Proxima has always been interesting for me from a content perspective, because you've always done really interesting things in some of the content that you brought out, some of the papers and campaigns. And there's something that Kelly, my partner at Art of Procurement, and I always kind of talk about, which is something which is years ago, around corporate visualization. And just things like that, just trying to take different perspectives on, the world of procurement and maybe help us think about things a little bit differently. So I always kind of appreciate that from whenever I see that you're putting things out there in the world.
Thank you.
Now, you were recently acquired, very recently, I think it's probably 2 or 3 months ago, by Bain and Company. And I just wonder if you could share a little bit about what that really means for Proxima, or what you think that means for Proxima, given it's only a couple of months in.
Yeah, when's this going to go out?
That's a good question. We may be a month or so further down the line, and this is old hat by the time it gets published.
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, just to reflect on Proxima. Proxima was around in various guises for a little over 25 years, and I think what you could say is that we've completed level 1, there's some people who were a big part of that, who've been a big influence on my career. But the most obvious part of it, I guess, is that we've just become part of something much bigger. Bain's clearly a much bigger company than Proxima, but interestingly, culturally very similar. And I think they share our vision, or we share their vision, or whichever way around that should be. And I mentioned about Philips that, and I think this is probably true for most people I've met, that the feeling attached to a vision of a company is a hugely important part for me of wanting to be there and turning up and doing your best work, being your whole self, I guess. And so I think the key thing is that both Bain and Proxima, and I'm sure like many others, we believe that procurement is part of the key to addressing the business challenges of today.
Yeah.
And that's sort of 101. We're not there to be a bolt onto the machine. We believe that strategically procurement can do something special, and that together, if we have an offering that lines up from the boardroom to the front line and can be modular, then we can help people in lots and lots of different ways. And I think from a personal perspective, I want to create I want to create a special procurement business. I want us to go and achieve special things and offer special career paths to people. And I'm hoping that that's what level 2 is all about.
Before we go into our main topic today, our main topic is going to be around storytelling. You're, as you said before, you're getting a big picture on procurement. You've made a lot of opinions over the last 10, 12 years at Proxima. There's few in the industry that I think are as well positioned to kind of take the 35,000 foot view of where we're heading as a profession. So I just wonder if you could share some of the things that you're seeing. Like, how are we holding up? How is procurement holding up right now? And is it actually everything going on in the world? Is that a good thing for us? Or is it something that we run the risk of being here in the moment, but it being kind of fleeting? I'd love to know what you're seeing.
Well, I mean, I can't remember what it is that they say about opinions, Phil, but I've certainly got a few, and they're not always right. So, but that's the beauty of them, isn't it? I think we're actually holding up really well. But the one thing I would say is that there's definitely a bell curve in terms of maturity, and a lot of what we see and what's fed to us through our sort of own media, which both you and I are a part of to a greater or lesser extent, is the best in class stuff, is the stuff that's really leading the thinking and the bleeding edge, and that's good, right? Because it should inspire you. But I like to think that one of the things that I always try to do is also offer a reality based temperature check on where things really are, because for every organisation that's out there at the bleeding edge, there's hundreds that aren't. And reading about it all the time can either inspire you or perhaps worse. But if you look at the sort of the big data, the macro indicators, there's more roles than there's ever been. So that suggests that companies are taking it seriously. There's more people qualified now than there's ever been. There's more people coming through the system. There's greater investment in technology than there's ever been, which suggests that the tech firms think they can make money from the profession, which is a pretty good indicator of health. But the fact that all of that is still got room suggests that there's a huge amount of room to grow and a huge direction to travel, not least what we can achieve with tech. But when you ask the question, you also have to look at the small data. I'm a big fan of small data, the things which connect with you individually and emotionally and buying triggers and stuff. And I think just in my world, I see a lot of younger, diverse talent coming in, better informed than perhaps you and I, better motivated than perhaps you and I were at their age. I'm seeing a sort of second or third generation of CPOs now appearing in role who perhaps have got different views and different long-term aspirations and different tools and talent at their disposal, which I think is really exciting. But perhaps the most important thing is that I don't have to explain what I do anymore at dinner parties. And so people kind of know what procurement is. It's no longer the world's second oldest profession. It's actually something that sits at the heart of businesses.
Yeah, there's not a day that goes by where you don't move for supply chain things in the news and connecting us with it suddenly becomes real when it's impacting people on their tables, not be able to get the things that they want every day. Even if that may be a little bit disconnected from some of the things we do from an indirect perspective, it makes it more real, I think, what we do.
I think that's right. But I mean, the person who's probably congratulations on episode number 500, by the way. But I think the person who's probably, you're one of the people who's probably most able to comment on over those 500, whether you think the profession's evolving. I mean, do you think it is? Do you think opinions are evolving? Maturity? Do you think the same things are coming up and round again?
You put me on the hot seat. It's me to put you on the hot seat, not the other way around.
There you go.
It's a really interesting one because I kind of sometimes get frustrated that I feel like we're talking about the same things now that we were talking about when I started out of procurement 7 years ago, but that I was talking about 22 whisper it years ago when I started in my first procurement job in the automotive business. And some of those practices that we were doing then in automotive around strategic sourcing and category management are still, they're not that consistently applied throughout industry. I kind of look it's funny going back to football. I did this an annual letter 4 years ago where I kind of tried to compare procurement maturity to the English professional football pyramid. And so, I looked at, you have League Two, so the bottom league in English professional football to procurement is those procurement teams are very transactional still. And it's really all about needing to change the mindset of what procurement can do. You have those that are at League One, they're on this journey to strategic, they're being strategic in some areas, but they're not really strategic across the business. You have those in the championship who have made it and they're strategic in the vast majority of categories that they touch, but they're always trying to still fight for relevancy. And then the Premier League, which is those who are really driving change, they're the ones you talked about before, the ones who perhaps have the newer CPOs coming in or newer ideas and trialing technology and have ways to incubate new ideas. And I see for the most part, most companies are kind of going between League One and League Two, and maybe occasionally they get to the championship, but then they drop down again, just depending on where the business cycle is. So are they needed a little bit more in their business? Well, then they become a bit more strategic. Then the need goes away, they get relegated again, they're a bit more tactical. And they're not really stepping up to be, true drivers of business strategy, and getting to the Premier League. And I still feel like we're at that point where probably only 5%, if that, are in the Premier League, and the rest are all just oscillating between League Two, League One, and the Championship, just depending on, situations and circumstances within their business. And I don't really see that many people breaking out of that, if you know what I mean, and joining that elite, if you will. And actually that gap's getting bigger as the ones that are interested in driving change are experimenting and trying new things and adopting new things, whereas those that aren't are still trying to struggle with, how do I get my spend analytics? How do I think about this category for the first time? Some of those things that are just have been challenges that have been present for years and years and years and years.
I think one of the most interesting sort of revelations for me, and maybe everyone knows this, maybe I'm really late to the party, but it just suddenly struck me that, and I've always said this, that success and value actually is in the eyes of the customer. And so therefore it sort of follows that procurement functions, there isn't one flavour of procurement functions.
Right.
You can't go in and say this is what procurement should do. And we developed a model which is way oversimplified, But essentially it says that procurement's not one function, it's three. It's a technology function where the value is delivering transparency, visibility, getting things quickly, reliably. And because it's a technology function, run it like a technology function. You don't run it on traditional procurement measures. You run it like essentially you're moving products around a network or much like you would with IT. At the other end of the scale, you've got the growth-orientated stuff, which not many people do, but you often find in hyperscale startups and stuff like that. Again, it's a very different skill set. You're looking at speed, return, and so run it like that sort of innovation growth function. Run it differently. Think about the KPIs that sit around that, and then in the middle, you've got this perhaps more traditional category management, supply chain management, whatever flavor it might be, which again is different. And so I think that what you often see, even in the examples of best in class, is that they're being called out for being able to do one of those things. And when you scratch the surface, perhaps the function isn't very good at some of the other things. But it's doing it because that's what the organization values. That's what success looks like. And so I think as a CPO, part of your challenge is not to just rinse and repeat, take what you've done before, do it somewhere else. Really figure out what does the organization value.
Right. I think that's at the heart of, and sometimes where we miss out on, because we focus on procurement, what procurement wants to achieve versus what's a good outcome for procurement versus what's a good outcome for the business, and those things aren't always aligned with each other. I look at having been on the procurement side and then as a service provider as well, I really think of procurement should think of themselves as a outsourced provider. You should be thinking of yourself as a business. And what's the first thing that a business has to do? It has to provide relevancy to its customers, and it has to provide value to its customers. As you said, whatever value means, because value is going to mean different things to different people. But that's how I always approach things, is how I think of myself as a business within a business. And then I might start thinking differently about what are the things that are actually important and how do I structure it, as opposed to, well, this is what best in class looks like. And I've always had a challenge with best in class, because best in whose class. And so we all aspire to these things, to be benchmarks that are out there that we see, but it might not really matter to the business that you're in.
And you mentioned earlier about some of the sort of circular conversations, things like measured on value, things like top table, a number of sort of times I've heard those. Another one is about how procurement should sell itself. And of course it's true, every function should sell itself. But one of the great revelations to me was when I took control of marketing and started working with marketeers, and the way that they looked at the world, and the way that they had this sort of focus on customers and being customer centric. And there's been a lot of talk about customer centricity over the last couple of years, and we've been on that bandwagon for 2 or 3 years now. And of course, such is the nature of the world. It's being sort of drowned out now by the next sort of trend, supplier centricity, and they're all important. I'm not moaning, but the concept that I sort of think is that if I'm procurement and I walk up to my stakeholder and say, what are your challenges? How can I help you? They're probably going to tell me a story of the things that they think I can solve for them. And even if I solve them, that's going to make it hard for me to punch out and actually truly delight them. I'm just going to deliver a good service. I think that concept of understanding your customer's customer, we call it customer squared, which is a bit, you judge us as you will for calling it that. But that concept of really deeply understanding the customer's customer and their challenges means that you can go over and above. You can figure out ways that ultimately suppliers can solve someone's real problems and do the things that they didn't think you could do. And I think getting to that sort of level of service delivery, if you like, it's a simplistic model, but I think that's what moves the needle.
No, I think one of the things that we've struggled with as a profession over the time that I've been in it is our vision on what the art of the possible is. So, and I've talked about this on a podcast about this notion of 10x procurement, that we've kind of boxed ourselves in to think that this is procurement's role, and therefore this is the role that we should play within an organisation. Well, who says that that's the role of procurement, except the traditions of this is what we think our role is? We need to be thinking differently about the vision that we have for procurement in terms of where do we fit organisationally in helping the organisation achieve its goals, and have, I feel like, loftier goals so that we have something else to achieve or something to aim for that goes beyond, being the folks who turn up to, help do the fast action SWAT team to save money when it's needed, or, those kind of guardrails that we put around ourselves. We need to lose those guardrails and think a little bit differently and a little bit bigger about what we're actually here to do and what we can do. And therefore, then we can start impressing that upon our stakeholders, because our stakeholders only know to expect from us the things that we've told them that we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can see, just by looking at you when you're talking about 10x, you can see the passion. You can see you start smiling. You can see it in your eyes. And I think that's the real importance of having that sort of compelling vision, isn't it? Something I said when I joined Philips. I found the brand something I could really get behind, and you need something to get behind as a function, but also as individuals. That concept of how can I do better this time? How can I stretch it a little bit further? Don't just settle for the status quo.
Yeah, we should always be challenging ourselves in procurement. And I find when I was a practitioner, I was more complaining about the fact that stakeholders didn't get what I did. And, woe is me, and that's their problem, not my problem, because they're missing out, as opposed to, okay, so how do I go and address that, and how do I approach it in a different way, or how do I reposition what I do, or, trying to figure out solutions to that problem, as opposed to just lamenting the fact that those problems exist.
Yeah, we talked about challenger thinking earlier, didn't we? And a challenger thinking on that stakeholders, don't really understand or care what I do. A challenger approach would be to say, all right, accept it. What are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
How are you going to work around it? How are you going to get their attention? If you accept that that's a given, how are you going to change it? And I think, approaching it from that sort of angle, not only can you start to break down some of those barriers, it's actually a lot more fun as well.
Well, there's this entrepreneurship, or intrapreneurship, if you're within a company, that you can bring with that kind of thinking, because you're trying to just think outside the box, challenge people, be proactive, be can-do, be resilient, all those things that you have to do when you're, in a small business. Actually applying that to your procurement team and to your relationship with your stakeholders means if you're not going to give up, you're going to keep trying to find a way, and eventually you'll find a way. If you don't try, then you're never going to find.
Yeah.
So we could probably spend a whole podcast, talking. No, I'm enjoying the conversation, but I do want to talk to you about storytelling, because I know that storytelling for you is something that's really important. It's something that I know you have a lot of expertise and experience in thinking about storytelling as just a way of connecting ideas and inspiring and helping people be interested in certain topics. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about why storytelling has become important for you and an important tool for you. I think it's, firstly, I'm not going to sit here and say I'm some sort of guru who is going to you're going to sort of be able to put on a pedestal and say, here's the greatest storyteller in the world. But I think by the nature of the roles that I've done over the last decade or so, I've probably had to stand up and deliver more stories or pitches or presentations than most. And by nature of the fact that I've done it more than most, I've probably screwed it up more than most and have more feedback than most. Yeah.
And so it's something that, just because of the nature of my personality, gives me, I don't know whether I enjoy doing it, but I enjoy putting myself in the position where I get that sort of adrenaline. And so I have tried to work at, can I become better at it? But genuinely, I am. Storytelling has changed my life. There's, and it will of everyone. If you think hard about it enough, it will of everybody. The times where you told a story that convinced someone to do something different, whether it's get a job or marry you, or or convince a team to do something, or a stakeholder to change something, or someone to invest in you.
Yeah.
It's the story part. Storytelling is a huge part of how you made it happen. But let me ask you another question. I mean, so you're out there, leading in this space. You've done remarkable things over the last 5 or 6 years to put yourself and AOP and procurement on the map. Who's inspired you, and what are the great stories that you've heard?
Yeah. That's a good question. There's no one individual that I could point to. I think I've been inspired in different ways. Generally speaking, I'm always inspired by the underdog story. I've always been somebody who roots for the underdog. Hence my choice of football team, amongst other things. But that being the underdog has always been something that has appealed to me and that I'm inspired by. I'm actually inspired by competition. Maybe that comes from sport as well, but I actually compete against myself, as a way of, it has to be data based, but I'm always, tracking data or tracking metrics and then trying to better myself against those metrics. And that's a way that I'm inspired to try and, do differently or to improve the things that I'm doing on a day-to-day basis. But for the podcast, when I started, I was inspired by, I lived and worked in India, and I was delivering, captive shared services back inside an automotive business. And we were building this capability where, the trend was that some jobs were going into low-cost countries, were being delivered back to teams in high-cost countries. There was also outsourcing was just in its infancy from a procurement perspective. I'd been involved in that as well. And I saw so many people resist that. And they were resisting the impact, the benefit they could get because they were fearful of it. And so I was inspired to try and break down those barriers so that people would not fear that change. They would embrace it because they would look at it as an opportunity to better themselves in some other way. That it would give them the opportunity to do something differently, or to get time off their plate, or have better data to make better decisions, to have more of an impact within the businesses. If I could just get them out of the fear mindset and into kind of a growth mindset. And so seeing that and doing that, within business then inspired me. Like, I see the same thing coming for procurement with technology. It's really the same thing. Like, technology is just like version 2 of some of the early outsourcing. How can we turn that fear into opportunity and think about what that can do for everyone, for their careers, for the teams they work in, for the impact that procurement can have if we do it. So those were some of the experiences, I guess, that inspired me to try and help others to tell the stories, to break some of those barriers down for people.
And I think what I really like about that is you started out talking about underdogs, and you spoke about fear and opportunity, and all of those things are emotion based.
Yeah.
And I think that's where storytelling comes into its own, and because the ability to tell a story is has to fit hand in glove with the ability to structure a story, the ability to use data, the ability to have conversations, which shouldn't be put to one side. That's hugely important, but the story is a big part of it as well. And those things need to work in tandem. But there's been some research done. And there's been research on all sorts of things, so you can do what you want with it. But it's by a guy called Martin Lindstrom, who is a brand marketing expert. It's a bit polarizing, but essentially the research that sits behind his biology and small data books is based on neuroscience, that 15% of our buying decisions as individuals are based on logic, and 85% are based on emotion.
Yeah.
Or I call it magic versus logic, because you can make the magic in your stories.
Yeah.
And so, if you think about a movie, well, the emotion part of it, let's just go back to that point around the underdog. Think about a movie you've seen. What happens in a movie? It's never the logical outcome, is it? If it was the logical outcome, Die Hard would have been a bit different, wouldn't it?
These movies are the last 20 minutes.
Yeah,
every time.
All sorts of things. But generally speaking, what happens is there's sort of a hero rises from impossible odds and blah 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 blah, and it's magic. And people often ask me for an example of a great story, and because I'm not sort of academically qualified on this matter, and because it's all self-taught and all of that, I usually get out the Gruffalo. And if you don't know the Gruffalo, look it up. It's a kid's book. It's there's been a stage and screen adaptation. There's merchandising, theme parks. It's a phenom.
We've had the books. We've been to the stage show.
Yeah, there you go.
Our young kids love the Gruffalo, and then all the books that spin off, as a result of it.
And the best thing, the reason why I love using it as an example is the Gruffalo is 24 pages long. There's 635 words, and within those 635 words, there's 5 characters. There's heroes and villains. There's danger. There's hope. There's an escape from impossible odds, and sort of a happy, feel-good ending. And when you read it, not a word is wasted. And the combination of the pictures on the book, the words, and the way that you put on your funny voices for your kids to read it. Those three things come together to create theatre.
Yeah.
And what I sort of say to people, or anyone who cares to listen, because I'm quite annoying, so I'll say it to anyone, is that actually that's not that different to us.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to go and do a presentation, you've got a bunch of those things at your disposal too. A PowerPoint, the words you're going to say, how you're going to say them, and 635 words. Most people put more than that on the first page of their PowerPoint.
Mm-hmm.
And yet you can pack all that in.
I think it's a tough idea for us in procurement that you're kind of brought up in procurement that the data speaks for itself. And yet, as you say, the 85% of decision making is actually not through the logic, but as you say, through the magic. We had one of the guests that I remember the most on the podcast was somebody called Rory Sutherland. Rory is a vice chairman at Ogilvy, and I think one of the leaders in behavioural science in the world. And he's talking a lot about behavioural science that comes to decision making and buying decisions, and how, again, it's not really the data. You're using the data to back up your decision, but that there's so many little things that people can do that you don't notice that help determine whether someone makes a decision or not. That's really there's so much there that goes away from what procurement traditionally thinks of as how we're going to help the business make a decision, that ties into some of the stories and the storytelling that you're talking about today.
I think that's absolutely right.
When you think about, because one of the great things about story, one of the challenging things, but it's also a great thing, is it can be a bit of a paint by numbers. Every movie follows ultimately the same 5 steps of the hero's journey, and there's something actually called in marketing called story brand that I'd really encourage anybody who's listening to go and check out, because it shows you what all the steps of a story are. How do you think about structuring a story before you tell the story?
Yeah, well, again, I personally sort of developed my own method, and there's lots of methods out there, and we use so in Proxima and a lot of other consultancies and journalists, etc., use a writing style called pyramid thinking to structure arguments. And what I don't want to do is go into that, because there's lots of those around. What I wanted to do is look at the things that were holding me back, or the things that I was making me less effective, or that I was worried about, and try and come up with a sort of structure that addressed those. And so I kind of developed my own, and I put it onto a canvas, because canvases were very popular at the time. And I structured it around 4 things: so purpose, audience, materials, and you.
And just to jump in, like a canvas for people to visualize, it's like a landscape A3 piece of paper with boxes essentially that take you through a process, or there's like a small business canvas, which was kind of the base of a lot of the canvases that then grew out of it, that help you go on a natural way through addressing or talking about a problem or an opportunity.
Absolutely, and that's exactly the canvas that I took the idea from, because I thought, for me personally, the way that my brain operates and the way that I have to see things visually, it was a way of me, you can see it, I've got one in front of me now. Mm-hmm. It's a way of me reminding myself of all sorts of things, whether that's, to be the 15% more that I have to be today, personality-wise, because, it's a podcast, or whether it's to listen to Boney M before it starts, to rev me up, or, whether it's some of the examples and stories. It's just something that's gonna help me visually. And so I did exactly that. But what I did was I asked myself questions in each of those boxes. And so on the first one, on purpose, it sounds bizarre, but a huge number of people think, well, I need to go and give a presentation, or I need to go and get an approval, or I need to write a report, and they start writing, and then their thought process comes out on the page, or on the 74 slides that follow. And your enthusiasm to tell the story sometimes gets in the way of why you're telling it. And so, simple questions: what's my story? Why am I telling it? What are the absolute key messages? And what do I want to happen as a result of me telling that story? And I think having those things flowing through every single piece of the story, and when you look at it and read it back and read it again, is it working? A bit like the 10X.
Yeah.
is what I'm doing now. I'm actually taking Phil's words now because he said this to me. Is what I'm doing now going to deliver 10x?
Right.
Is what I'm writing now, is what I'm saying now, is it making me more effective? Is it getting across what I want to get across? Is it clear what I want people to do with it? So
kind of having that in front of you, because I'm definitely guilty of opening up the PowerPoint presentation and making up the story as, slide by slide, as opposed to going at the beginning and saying, okay, this is what I want to try and achieve, and remembering, like, having almost these principles of the story that I want to tell, so you don't get 10 slides in and feel like, well, maybe I went on a different direction than I really wanted to go to, which has definitely happened to me before.
Yeah, but creativity comes to each of us in different ways, and I'm guilty of doing that sometimes. I mean, I usually, whenever I've been doing proposals or pitches or writing transformation stories, I've always tried to start with a whiteboard and a view on what's the journey, who am I telling it to, and try and sort of sketch it out and let that govern me. But it's not always possible. Sometimes you just got to get some thoughts down and then go back and revisit. But the key is to go back and revisit.
Right. It's also really important, that persona. That's what you get taught in sales and marketing, is to understand your persona and make sure that you're writing or you're creating content or talking to, knowing who that person is, so you can visualize. Like, you may know when you're writing a presentation it's for this person, so you can visualize writing it for them. But if you don't, and it's more of a general, you don't know the individuals you're going to be presenting to or telling the story to, at least having in mind what their characteristics are, and keeping that in mind, because otherwise you end up creating something that isn't relevant for the folks that who your intended audience is.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the second. That's coincidentally that's the second box that I have, which is all about the audience. And it is exactly, the best stories are written for the audience. Whether it's a song, whether it's a play, whether it's a stand-up comedian, whether it's a business presentation. Think about it. The idea is that someone in that audience goes away inspired to do something different, or to go and tell the jokes, or to go and tell people how great it was, or to have the song in their heart. The presentation is about the audience. And so I think you have to ask yourself, or the things that I ask myself are, who is my audience and why should they be interested, and what's in it for them? I've got to see it through their eyes. And I think that's especially important in business when you're presenting to stakeholders, to see it through their eyes. And it will enable you to sort of unpack some of the questions that they might ask you that you need to be able to answer, which is going to sort of build that trust. And I think it's really important that you make it their story, because if you don't do that, it's just you right. Talking. It's like any old procurement event, watching someone stand up talking about themselves.
Yeah, which after 5 minutes you then either go for the phone and try and get distracted, or you walk out of.
100%. Just a case in point, your audience down to a T, don't you?
Yeah, and I've learned that over time. When I started, I didn't know who my audience was, and in fact I was creating content for me, not creating content for anybody else. I was thinking, what are the things that I would find really interesting, and hopefully other people will find that interesting too. And I think to some extent I still follow that itch a little bit. But yeah, from our audience perspective, as it's grown and evolved, and as we learn more about them, I think we look at it as being, and people listening may shake their head now if I'm not describing who they are, but we look at our audience as being folks who, are procurement leaders, or people who aspire to be a procurement leader. And I don't mean necessarily leadership in terms of role, but also just leadership in terms of being a leading practitioner in their craft at what they want to do. They want to be the best at what they do. It's people that are motivated to really drive change, not just for the sake of driving change, because that can create more problems than it solves, but because, going back to this 10x idea, that they want to 10x their impact personally, or they want to help their business 10x the outcomes that they drive. They want to be inspired by new ways of doing things, or they want to benchmark what it is that they're doing today against their existing approaches. I think what's really important to us is that exponential growth mindset that I feel like a lot of our, if not all of our community have, because we're not trying to create content for everybody, we're trying to create content for those people who want to be part of the movement to really 10x the impact of procurement. And there'll be some people who come and listen, and after a podcast or two, or reading something we've written or whatever, we're not for them. that's okay, because we're not trying to be everything for everybody.
I think what's brilliant there is you've just described your audience and your purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you say it takes you a bit of time to get there. There's probably people listening to this who think you just turn up and do a podcast. There's probably people who do just turn up and do podcasts, and yet it's that fundamental understanding of who are these people, what do they need, why should they be interested, and therefore tailoring my offering, which I think is what will make you stand out as a host or as an individual. And then I think once you understand those two things, you can start to think about your materials. So a lot of people start with materials, but I'll take you back to the Gruffalo, right? You've got pictures, words, your voice. Now think about it in a business context. You've got pictures, words, your voice. Yeah. You've got pre-reads, reports. You've got all sorts of different ways that you can convey this message. And it might be different every time. But when you think about your audience, it'll give you that thinking of, well, how am I going to tell this story? What are the right tools to use? I'm going to give you a really interesting example. This was a really fantastic moment in my career when I was riding high, used to presenting, thought I was pretty good at it, and my boss said to me, right, you got this new pitch series coming up for this product we've developed. I'm going to get in a presenting coach for you. And I thought, oh, well, that sounds good. I was kind of like, I think I'm pretty good at this, but I'm open to it. Let's give it a go. And who turns up? It's a guy called Neil Malarkey. Now, you might not know who Neil Malarkey is. He used to go on a show called Whose Line Is It Anyway? Okay. Which was pretty popular. And he was also in some of the Austin Powers movies, a big friend of Mike Myers. And he does, he's a stand-up comedian, basically, and a sort of business coach. So I sit in a room with Neil. Just to give you a flavour, everyone's been in one of these rooms. It was called the Inspiration Room, and that means it was down the end of a corridor somewhere where nobody went. There was too many chairs in there, and most of the backs were broken, and etc. etc. But Neil sits at the end of one long table, and I sit at the other end, and he says, "Do your presentation." And I do my presentation. It takes, let's say, 26, 27 minutes, and I'm pretty happy with myself. And he sits there and he says, "Well, I like this, this, and this, and were those the main points?" And I said, "Yeah, I think they were." He said, "Good." He said, "They came across." And then he rolled a pen down the table and he said, "Right." He said, "You've got half an hour and you've got that whiteboard. And at the end of that half an hour, I want you to pitch to me again. No slides, 10 minutes. I thought, well, this is interesting. So I did, and I did the pitch back, and I got all of the key messages across, and it took me about 12 minutes. So the net effect was I cut my content in half. Yeah. I was more direct, and respected perhaps the person at the other end of the table. So I'd always encourage people to go through after they've written something and take out every unnecessary word, or film themselves delivering something. You can ask people for feedback, but people don't always give you honest feedback. So record yourself and then think to yourself, right, how can I do this in 3 lines, 30 seconds, 5 minutes, whatever it is? Challenge yourself to do it differently, because believe me, you can. Yeah. And you'll be much more focused.
How do you find yourself watching or listening back to yourself? Is it something that you've had to tolerate, should I say, or do you not have a problem with doing that?
I'm a massive introvert, and so I find it difficult. I'm intensely critical. After today, I'll sit on the train going back thinking about all the things I didn't say, that I wanted to say, worrying if it came out okay. So I find it hugely difficult, but hugely instructive. And I think there's the last box that I have is all about you, or me, it says on mine, but it's all about how to make yourself shine. And I think that's an integral part of that. And I think you have to have some tips and tricks to get you on the top of your game. And I think that's watching yourself back can be a very humbling, a very instructive experience of what it feels like to be in the audience watching you.
As long as you're not too harsh on yourself, which I find myself, and that maybe the introversion coming in as well, of you see the blemishes that other people don't see.
Yeah, and I mean, someone I can remember very clearly getting a question on that. And generally speaking, when you walk into a room, people are wanting you to succeed or wanting to hear what you have to say. And that's partly in the audience piece.
Mm-hmm.
Getting that clear, understanding that before you go in, I think is really important. But I think there's a couple of simple things that I ask myself. So I ask myself, who do I want to be when I go into that room? Do I want to be the expert, the friend, the leader, the coach? What do I want how do I want to come across?
Yeah.
And how do I sort of lift it up? And then it's about how am I going to prepare myself and critically the team around me. Now an old boss of mine, a chap called JCB, used to use a phrase which I think is it's so simple but it's so true. Can you imagine an actor going on stage for the first night of a new production not having rehearsed?
Mm-hmm.
Well, why do you do it?
Yeah.
And when someone asks you that question, you feel stupid.
Yeah, because we do it all the time. Right?
Yeah, and I've been in situations where, worse still, I've rehearsed, but I haven't rehearsed with the people around me, and I don't know what they're going to say, and therefore I'm not very good. So I always ask myself, how am I going to prepare? And the third thing I always ask myself is about, how am I going to G myself up and anchor myself back? So I put my watch on the table.
Yeah.
The watch, I usually use a set of cufflinks, but I'm a bit informal today. In fact, I haven't worn cufflinks for a very long time, so I'm going to have to get something new. But the idea behind those is if I feel like I'm losing control, is to anchor me back to, why am I here? Who am I supposed to be? What would, if things are going off? I had a great quote the other day, what would your hero do in this situation? Which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
How can you get your motivation back and start controlling it again? But I think it's really important that you think about how you're going to shine. I think, interestingly, you mentioned it just then. We discussed it before about being introverts, and I think that means you have to challenge yourself. So, how did you switch yourself on, particularly in the early days?
It's really hard, and I don't think I've ever got I wouldn't ever say that I have that under control entirely. Like, I still really struggle with going on stage, and that's still a uphill battle for me. Actually, in the early days of doing the podcast, I think that the confidence is the antidote to being an introvert. Once you have confidence in what you do, I think the doubts disappear. I think that in work, when I was a practitioner, once I started to get confidence in the things that I did and being able to negotiate and getting results, meant that I was going in, thinking to negotiations, thinking that, I'm the king of the castle kind of thing, as opposed to meekly asking for 3%. And maybe having confidence comes from having all the information and the data, and you kind of know what you're talking about. But I think confidence is really, I feel like you can do a lot of things when you have confidence, and I'm certainly a confidence person. I took confidence in the early days from when I was doing the podcast, in doing it with inviting people on the show who I respected and put on a on a plateau, and them coming and saying, I'm nervous about doing this. And that gave me confidence that actually it's not unnatural to feel as though this is something that, the people that I think would just ace it, you would turn the microphone on and the record button on, and they would struggle with it too. And so that made me think, well, it's not just a me issue. We all kind of suffer from these things when we're doing podcasts. And that gave me confidence in that it wasn't just me, that kind of felt like that. I think in the early days, I set myself targets of, I have to publish every week. By hook or by crook, I've got to go and do this. So that forced me to be consistent and to put myself out there, when it would have been easier to go and hide and not do this, because it was really hard to start doing a podcast for me and to put myself out there. To start with, I was scared stiff. I would script 100% of the episodes. I was afraid of asking bad questions or offending anybody by asking anything. I would go and edit out every single imperfection. If there was a gap of me asking a question, I would edit that gap out. If there were I would edit those out. I would edit out all the that I would the affirmative noises I would make. And it got to maybe a year in when I thought, screw it. Either this is who I am. People are going to like that. People are not going to like that. It's their decision, not my decision. It's not going to stop me trying to be better at what I do and try and learn and try and study from people who do a much better job than I do. at interviewing so I can take some things from them, but I'm going to stop trying to be somebody who I'm not. And that was a big help, I think.
I think it's nice that you've moved on as well from putting people that you respect on the podcast, which is and I think the concept of authenticity. I think for me personally, the people that I've enjoyed listening to or watching the most are not necessarily the most brash or flash.
Yeah.
They're the ones that come across as authentic, and I think that's really really key. But I guess for me, I get very anxious before I do something. I think there's a question on how you turn anxiety into adrenaline, which I think is really interesting to explore. Adrenaline is obviously a very positive thing, and I think what I figured out was that most of it came down to practice. Mm-hmm. Slight segue. When I was looking at doing this today, and I was thinking about practice. For some reason, I said I'm annoying. I'll prove it now. According to there's a website where you can look. I think it's called Setlist, and you can go and see how many times an artist has performed a song. Mm-hmm. So I found out that Frank Sinatra's performed My Way 1,248 times, and it's 4 minutes and 35 seconds long, mm-hmm. which basically means he spent 4 days singing My Way. So he's going to be pretty good at it. Yeah. I also found out that Paul McCartney's sung Nah for basically a day from mm-hmm. Hey Jude. So he's going to be pretty good at singing Nah. And whenever you see these people who, quite often you admire go on stage, they're doing something which is, it's scripted to the point that they can then make it natural again. Yeah. They know exactly where they're going. And so, I guess part of what I needed to do to reduce anxiety and make more of an impact was to get that preparation right around the purpose audience materials and me, how I was going to go and do that. But then there's a bunch of other stuff. So if you suffer from anxiety, or if that sort of gets into you, what happens is the average person has 6,200 thoughts a day. Probably about 5,000 of those are going through your head in the 5 minutes before you're due to speak. And in my sense, what happens is I start asking myself loads of questions. Yeah. What if this happens? What if that happens? What if this happens? And so the point I'm trying to make is that if you go into a room and you haven't prepared, you're essentially relying on your natural ability, and everything else is up for chance. And if you can start to take away some of that up for chance, you can reduce some of that anxiety and turn it into adrenaline, because you've prepared for different eventualities. But maybe it's not the big things. Maybe it's some of the small things, like where am I going? Who am I meeting? What does the room look like? What's my intro? What's my chit chat? Have I got some facts? What does it sound like when I read this stuff? Yeah. Have I heard my voice do it? How long is it? Failed on that one today. What does good look like? What does the next best thing to good look like? Because sometimes it goes off track, and you need to circle back and say, well, did we achieve it? And I think the two critical things: what questions am I going to be asked, and what questions can I ask? Mm-hmm. And I think if you try and do those things in advance, you can reduce some of that uncertainty, or at least you're prepared for different sorts of eventualities. And I think then when the 5,000 thoughts and the questions start flying at you, there's answers flying back, and it makes you feel pumped rather than pumped.
Yeah, you're getting into where it's no longer a performance and it's a conversation. Yeah, I think that's the line for me, is when I feel it's a performance. So you're standing up on stage and people are watching you, waiting for something is hard. When it's a conversation, it's like the whole fear disappears, and now I'm just chatting about something I know really well. I struggle with the balance between over and under preparing when I'm speaking on stage, because I'd find myself over preparing, but then my preparation becomes the crutch, and so I'm focused on my cue cards as opposed to taking a step back and thinking about what is it I'm trying to say and what am I trying to talk about and what's the topic. But if I go in underprepared, then I'm just going to forget everything. For a lot of the podcasts that I do, I've done this for long enough now where some of them I still have like a script to follow, but I've had enough practice where I can use that as a guide, as opposed to, I'm going to read this word for word. And if I'm going to read any bits word for word, enough practice that it doesn't feel as though to the listener that I'm just reading something. Because when you overscript something, that's something like listeners can pick up really easily, that you've just got pages and pages and pages and pages of text and you're just reading verbatim.
And I think it's really interesting because I actually find standing on stage easier because I find there's safety up there. No one's going to send you off track. You don't know how it's going to go. But I get your point around focusing on the cue card somewhere, and I think that's where the importance of actually rehearsing it in front of someone as well as yourself to get clarity.
I feel safer when there's two people, when I'm on stage with somebody else, as opposed to when I'm just the only one on stage when it's in person, because you feel as though you can bounce off the other person on the stage, and maybe there's some protection in case you're there to help each other out to make sure that things don't go off the rail and now you're struggling about how do I bring this back in again. And most of it is all in your head. I mean, most of it is, what you said earlier about you look, you think that things that you see that you think you've done wrong are not actually things that anybody else sees. But I feel that a lot when I'm on stage. I'm always looking for the negatives of what I did rather than the positives of what I did.
Which I think is why it becomes super important for anybody to define what does success look like and what does the next best thing look like before they go in. Because you have to come out and say, well, did I achieve what I wanted to achieve? And invariably, you probably did.
Now, we've talked a lot about kind of the preparation that you go through in terms of telling stories. And then you had to apply that during the pandemic. You were on the BBC a few times. You were certainly quoted in the press a few times. That sounds pretty scary. How were you able to apply practices you learned from ultimately being on national television?
Yeah, it was really scary actually, but a tremendous privilege and a great experience, one that I'm very grateful for. Really, I applied this sort of thinking. So when the BBC or any other news channel asks you to do something, it's because they want to deliver a service or information to their audience. And so you have to start thinking about, well, firstly, what's their audience and what's going to be interesting to them, alongside, what do I want to impart as knowledge and what do I think that they would want to know. And so, you really have to think, I'm not talking to a procurement audience now, I'm talking to a national audience. I might be talking to business leaders or their partners or their kids, or certainly their kids in my case. And so how am I going to tell the facts and the story in a way that makes sense to them? And the reality is you're going to be there for 3 to 4 minutes, and you've got to trawl through and try and think, how am I going to make an impact? How am I going to be perhaps a little bit memorable or a little bit quirky or say something interesting? And so the first time I did it, I probably prepared for that 4 minutes for 6 or 7 hours, maybe more. I asked people who are far more qualified on the subject than me, but perhaps didn't have the opportunity that I had, for opinions, to formulate my own. I wrote down what I thought the questions might be, what I thought might be interesting. And then my poor wife, my wonderful wife, watched me several times and asked me the questions, and I responded to her. So by the time I sat there, a bit like a good job interview, I knew that there were 5 or 6 things that I wanted to say, and I knew that there were 3 or 4 ways of getting into those 5 or 6 things. And then I finished the slot. It was early in the morning, and I basically had so much adrenaline I didn't know what to do with myself for about 6 hours.
Yep, I hear that. Yeah. Preparation being key by the sounds of it. And I've only done radio, where I've been on the BBC doing some things more related to football side of things actually, but go through the same process of preparation, of writing everything down, of understanding where conversation can go and having points based on where it goes. Much easier on radio than it is on TV, because you can look at your notes when you're doing it rather than having to remember it all in your head.
Yeah, well, I actually plastered my notes all around my screen. But it's a really interesting point, right? Because it's a massive privilege to be able to do something like that, and you want to be at your best.
Yeah.
But you also want to do something useful for the people watching, don't you? You don't just want to. I'm sure it's the same in every industry, but we do see the same old, and you just want to do something a little bit interesting.
Yeah, not just show up and wing it.
Yeah, I'm not very good at that.
Well, Simon, this has been a fascinating conversation. We've covered a lot from the health of procurement to lots of just really interesting perspectives and structure around storytelling. I think that it's one of those skills that we as procurement professionals could always learn and always be better at, myself included for sure, in that, because data doesn't tell all the story for us, and we often rely, I think, too heavily on data. Also for vulnerabilities, it's been really interesting to chat about strengths, weaknesses, how we try and overcome them, because we all have things where we probably think that we're not as good as we are at something, and sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not true. But I just love talking to you about this. So my last question is hopefully the easy one. I always say it's the easy one, and that is, where can people find you if they want to connect with you and learn a little bit more about you, or learn a little bit more about Proxima as well?
Well, the obvious place is on LinkedIn. You can find me as Simon Geale. It's not the most conventional surname to spell, but I'm sure it's there on the blurb for the podcast. And look, Phil, thanks very much. It's a massive privilege, and keep up the good work.
Thank you very much. Well, I will put your link to your LinkedIn profile on the show notes page for the podcast. That will be there for anybody at artofprocurement.com/podcast, artofprocurement.com/podcast. So one last time, Simon, thank you so much today.
Thank you.
If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, an event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe.